Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and today I'm going to be talking about the Chief Transformation Officer and why you may actually need one. And so it's a lot of confusion around what the Chief Transformation Officer does. And one of the reasons I think it's so important to have one is because if you're like most organizations, you're going through and changing so many things. You have probably been going through a digital transformation and paying a lot of technology debt. You may be going through a culture transformation, given all the changes we've gone through over the past 3 years. And our culture has definitely changed. And people just need to be seen and led in a very different way. So you're probably going through a culture change too, as well. And for many organizations, we're going through a sustainability transformation too, trying to figure out how do we be more sustainable in the ways that we run our businesses and our lives. So this isn't just about the environment and the planet, but how do we also impact our societies, our communities, our employees, the people, our customers. So all the different stakeholders in an organization. How do we sustain this for the long term and not just think about short-term gains? So today I want to go through a lot of these things, and in particular, just how do we actually do this? So I'd love for you to all talk a little bit about just share who manages your transformations in your organizations. Is it the CEO? Is it a project manager? Do you actually have a chief transformation officer? Would love to know that, and by all means, please share that because especially for people who may be joining later viewing this after the live stream, please add your comments because it's really helpful to understand. Are you thinking about getting a chief transform officer? If you've gotten one, what was the thing that spurred you to get one? And what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the research I've been doing about when do you need one? Why do you need one? How do you find one? What are the chief roles and characteristics of a chief transformation officer? So I just want to go into a little bit of this. One of the most interesting things that comes across, I hear from people, is that when you have a CTO, I'm just going to use a shortcut, and this is not a chief technology officer. Again, it's a chief transformation officer. It is somebody who really comes in and starts piecing apart all the different things you have going on in the business. In particular, you may have some really outdated um, technologies and processes that just need to be torn apart and put back together again. There may also be some organizational um, entanglement where if you try to make one change over here, it spills over and makes changes someplace else. And a good example of this is digital transformation, where as long as you were sticking within a department or a team, a certain business unit, maybe, as long as it was fairly discreet, you could get away with doing a lot of the digitalization work. It's when you start moving across and you realize, wait a minute, digitizing my customer data over here in sales has implications for marketing, has implications across customer service, and it starts getting really messy. And it becomes very difficult for organizations to work across all of these different departments to get everyone to be aligned. And usually the organization comes up and meets only in one place, and that's the CEO's position. And so the chief transformation officer's role is to be an extension of the CEO. Whereas the CEO has to look at everything in the organization, not just the current operations, but all the innovations and things, and also report back to the board. I mean, there's a lot sitting on the shoulders of the CEO. The CEO can then delegate the transformation work over to somebody else. And that's the role of the chief transformation officer is to take on a lot of this heavy lifting, the block and tackle of making all of this work together. So again, you start seeing this need for a CTO when there are a significant number of initiatives that go across different functions or go across different business units. And that's when you go, okay, it's time to get somebody who can speak with the authority and the support of the CEO and can get these things done and go deep into the details and make sure it all happens. Um, there's a quote that I found from one CTO that my role is helping leadership advance the value creation agenda of the company. We have a well-defined value creation timeline set up by our private equity owners, and we know what the levers generally are. I work to convert all of that into a measurable plan. I take the business from the 50 things we could be working on to the 10 things that we are going to focus on. And then I get involved in those plans as appropriate to make sure we achieve them. I thought that was a great summary of what a CTO does because there are so many things you could do. How do we start coordinating all of them and putting them into one bucket, one long to-do list of all the things we're going to get done? And also just as importantly, what are we not going to do and take on? One of the things that I often get asked is, what's the difference between a program management office and a transformation management office? And project management or program management tend to be very discrete set of projects. Program management might be managing a lot of different projects, and even portfolios may be looking at programs that may be unrelated to each other, but at least portfolio programs and projects, all these P's are working together. The transformation office, management office, which the chief transformation officer runs, is very different. This is a role where you're really in charge of making big changes to the business, to the business strategy. And it's a transformational business strategy that happens up here at this level, but you're the person who needs to align all the changes and the initiatives to make sure it supports that business strategy. It also involves transforming the culture. And so we think about digital transformation, oftentimes it doesn't take into account the culture transformation. And then you have all these other initiatives that keep coming up, like sustainability. And what you're left with is a lot of different transformations that need to be coordinated. This is why so many companies have this chief transformation officer to make sure that all these initiatives are happening in a coordinated way. So, what does the TMO actually do, the transformation officer, the CTO? And there are a couple things. The first one, I think, is being a corporate architect. It's somebody who is thinking about what is it that they need to restructure the business to look like. They're doing so. Being an architect, you're looking at the design of the business. You're thinking about all the business frameworks. And one of the most interesting things about this is that you're looking at redesigning in some ways what is already there. So pulling the pieces apart and putting them back together in a logical way while still continuing with the operations. You can't stop. You have to keep going. So it's a very delicate balance that you have to be this corporate architect and build things while things are still moving. There's a lot of innovation that has to happen. So new technologies that come in. So you have to feel like, as a CTO, that you can be this innovator and bring new ideas into the organization. The most important thing I think is to be a customer advocate. It's everything that you're doing is geared towards the customer. So whatever justification you have, it's not because of some design or some internal role politics. It's because we're doing this to be better able to serve the customer. And then the person needs to be a collaborator, a really strong collaborator with the other members of the C-suite across up and down the organization, and to deal with politics really well. I mean, this is something that I've learned in working for a very large organization now. I mean, in the scheme of things, it's not that large, it's 4,500 people, but there are things like politics, but the politics are more about how do you understand somebody's interests and align what you're trying to do with those interests. So it's not a negative thing. It's much more about a reality that when you're working with a lot of people in a lot of different directions, you need to make sure everyone is aligned. And one of the best ways to do that is to be a storyteller, where you're creating a narrative of what this change is going to look like, what it's going to be. And that narrative then can be picked up for other people to be able to take on and tell their own stories on top of that narrative. So a CTO does a lot of different things. They have to be a corporate architect, that innovator, the customer advocate, the collaborator, and the storyteller. So lots of different things that a CTO has to do. And I just want to go see that we have one comment here. It's a bit of a long one, but I just want to put it up. Robin Post says, in my past place of employment, the leadership team of the organization handled what was to change, but unfortunately did not get buy-in from employees first, nor did they assess the ability of to implement the change and clear employees' plates first. They didn't always provide great training, and no one was managing the implementation of the change. This sounds so familiar. It creates enormous confusion, frustration, burnout, and attrition. Rama, it sounds like a nightmare to have gone through that. And so many people experience what I call change fatigue, primarily because we see change that we've gone through in the past. People said, this is what we do. But again, this is the change we want to create, but they don't follow through. The change is not well done. Implementation sounds like a mess. Again, Robin, from your experience, it makes you think, I don't want to go through any more change. No more transformation for me, please, because I don't have any confidence that you can do this. And I think if that organization had done a better job of thinking through the change and especially getting people on board, this is why the CTO's role as a storyteller to explain the change to people is so important. Marissa, good to see you, Marissa. Says, I work for a small business professionally, so no CTO there. Again, small business tend to not have to need this. But in my nonprofit work, I'm fulfilling the transformation disruption role as part of my president responsibilities. I think that's so interesting that you're taking on this role, Marissa, in a nonprofit as the president of that nonprofit and really leading more of that transformation. And so fantastic for you. I'd love to hear more about how you see your role and then also how you are organizing it so that the implementation of the changes actually work really well. And so let's see. And then Marissa just has a little bit of follow up. I'm driving my team to work collaboratively to look more holistically at our needs as we move forward. And I think that's a great point because it's so important that you are working with your team, that the CTO, the change agent, the person who's driving this disruption is working very, very closely with employees. And Jay had a great question around this, just to follow up on that. It seems like employees in this discussion get short shrift. In many ways, I think employees are the most important part. And I'll tell you what one of the best best practices that I've seen CTOs do in the management offices is that they really take into account what needs to go on the agenda and also what needs to get off of the agenda. I mentioned in that quote, they talk about the 50 things they could do and narrow it down to the 10. First of all, that prioritization is a really, really important thing that they do. And so I think about the 5 qualities of a chief transformation officer. It's the prioritization skills about what's important, what's not. And I talked to one a while ago, and one of the things he said was when we go to a department and says, these are the things we need you to take on, what are the things you're going to take off? We are asking to add these things to your agenda, to your work, to create this change. What are the things that are not going to happen anymore? And they work together to figure out what the priorities are going to be. So that prioritization becomes so important in being able to do that. And again, I think if there are 5 calls, I'll go through them very quickly. They're the prioritization skills, the operations experience, financial expertise, because you want to be able to understand what this is going to cost and what the benefits going to be. The ability to go really deep, to be able to find the hidden problems that are there, cover them. It's not just staying at the surface. And we all know people who say, oh, just make that change happen. Well, you need to know the details that if you pull this thread, then all these other things might unravel and then have a plan for that. And then finally, you need a lot of resilience because this is really hard work. Creating change and disruption is a really hard thing to do. So I have a couple more comments here. So we have Aniola, who says, most small businesses have their CEOs acting in that capacity. But I think for the sake of the required change, the role should be what senior managers should display every now and then. I think that's a good point that It's not just the CEO who does this, it's also the other managers inside the organization. And that is not only the responsibility of the CEO. The CEO may turn to somebody and say, "Oh, can you take on this change? Can you make this happen? I'm going to designate you as our chief transformation officer, as well as the other jobs you may be doing, or I may need you to actually stop doing those jobs and actually drive this transformation." And the thing is, with small businesses in particular, you may not feel like, do I need this extra role? Well, it depends on how big that change is. And one of the key questions, again, that I started out with is, when do you know that you need a CTO? When you have a lot of changes happening that defy just clear definitions. They're not just a checklist of launching a new product. It's not just something that's fairly straightforward, like a project. It's going to require a lot of buy-in. There's going to be culture change around it. It's going to impact the business. When it's truly going to be transformational, then you can't, if it's going to be a big change, then you can't leave it to chance. You really need somebody to drive that and make sure that everyone is aligned, everyone knows what is going on. I have a couple other comments here. From a LinkedIn user, I've driven digital transformation in the past, and I've seen the culture reverse the change back to its comfort level once key leaders move on to different roles in different organizations. How does a transformation officer ensure the change sticks, say, 5+ years later? Great question. I'm a big believer in making the transformation management office a permanent position. And the reason why is, I think once you are, quote, done with a transformation, you're never quite done because there's other transformations that need to happen. If you treat it like a project, which is what most digital transformations are seen as, it's a project with a beginning and an end. But if you think about digital transformation as just one of many transformations, then it becomes this role that the transformation management office and the chief transformation officer has to continue to make sure that transformation continues, that it sticks, that the culture change is real and has happened. And the biggest problem with digital transformation is that we oftentimes look at the digital part, the technology part, but not the transformation part. And that's a big problem because if you're not looking at the culture and ensuring that it's actually changed, then it's not going to work really well. And so I think to the example that you talked about, how do transformations officers ensure the change sticks? They stick around themselves. They're around to make sure that this is happening, that it continues, and they're managing other transformations that are happening. I'd like to say that there is no more things like called change management. Instead, you're constantly managing change and transformation. And so we constantly have to think about that. All right, so here's another question from Medina. Nowadays, in many organizations, CTOs are often hired from IT since transformations are now equal to digital change. Are there any examples where CTOs come from employee experience and customer experience background, given that employee engagement, compelling storytelling, customer advocacy are important components of change? Yes, there are quite a few. And many, I don't have the examples right here, but I think of one in particular. He comes from a financial services organization. And this person was a product person who could see the reasons why the change needed to happen, understood the transformation. And the reason why this person was picked was because of their incredible customer focus. Again, customer focus is a key skill that a CTO needs to have. And what they had underneath them was some really strong IT people that they pulled onto the team, onto the transformation management office team. So, but the person at the very top didn't have to know all the technology. They relied on those other people to drive the technology. And again, it was a realization that the skills of a CTO are much more diverse than being able to see the technology. It's again that storytelling around what the customer need was and how that required this change happen. It was being able to understand the politics and the internal workings, architect the internal organizations. And oftentimes, people coming from IT have not had that experience in terms of working inside the organization. So I think many times, again, this is not the chief technology officer, but the chief transformation officer. Again, remembering that transformation isn't just about digital, it's much more about the transformation. How do you get the organization and the people inside it in particular to change and then to make the change fit? So, great question, Medina. I think it's one of the experiences that we had. Um, so let's see. I just have some other comments from Jay, commenting that experienced many times the CEO as a change management champion says everyone needs to change. But I don't actually have to change as a CEO. It is one of the biggest issues that I hear from leaders, like all of you need to change, but not me. And in many ways, the best way to demonstrate that change is happening is needed is when you show up in a different way. Oftentimes, I'll go into workshops with executives and I ask them, how are you going to show up differently when you go home? When you go back to your office? What are you going to do differently? What are you going to say differently? How are you going to think differently? How will you show up in a different way to signal that a change is going to happen or is happening already? Because if nothing changes in the way that you behave, in your beliefs, then nothing else is going to change. The role modeling is so important, and it's one of the key things that chief transformation officers are doing is they're doing a lot of role modeling. They're saying, "Yeah, I know this is the way we used to do things, but now we're going to do things in a different way. And then how do we actually manage that?" So, a couple of quick things to just finish up on for today. The last things I wanted to say, I talked about some best practices around making sure you're taking things off and when you're adding things. Next week, I'm actually going to be talking about a different topic, which is about how do you actually start doing that strategic planning in a way that supports transformations. And I'll do something called how do called the 6 quarter walk. I've mentioned it briefly in the past, but when I've shared this model with people, people really like it a lot. So I'm going to go into more detail about how the 6 quarter walk, a plan of 6 quarters, 18 months, can really help with your strategic planning and your execution. And I actually learned this from a chief transformation officer. And actually, I was working very, very closely with the CEO to be able to talk about all the different ways to incorporate all the different transformations that are in and make sure that everyone's aligned. So until we meet again a week from now, I encourage you to think about how do you actually run transformations in your organization? How do you think about ensuring that you have the transformation elements in the right place? And think about whether you need a chief transformation officer to come and help you make sure that these initiatives get moving. All right, take care. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks.